Revered and respected by our ancestors for thousands of years, demonized and suppressed by the war on drugs, and now at the dawn of a new millennia, they are making their triumphant return. Scientists, researchers, and patients alike are exploring these ancient therapies to heal modern ailments. And we're here to bring you the latest in scientific research, cutting-edge practices, and first-hand experiences from those who have been transformed in body, mind, and spirit by plant medicines from cannabis to psilocybin to ayahuasca and beyond. This is the Plant Medicine Podcast.
Hello and welcome to a very special episode of the Plant Medicine Podcast. I'm Dr. Lynn Marie Morsky, your guide on this journey, and today we have the very last episode in our Encyclopedia of Medicine series, and my friends, I have saved the best for last. As today I have the honor of bringing you an interview with James Fadiman answering your microdosing questions. Now, for most of you, James Fadiman needs no introduction, but I will read his bio anyway. Dr. James Fadiman was a part of the first wave of pioneering psychedelic researchers in the 1960s in the US. He's the co-founder of the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, which later became Sophia University, and the author of several well-known psychedelic books, including the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. He received a Bachelor of Arts degree from Harvard University in 1960. While in Paris in 1961, his friend and former Harvard undergraduate advisor, Ram Dass, then known as Richard Alpert, introduced him to psychedelics. While living in Menlo Park, Fadiman and his wife were Ken Kesey's Perry Lane neighbors and friends. He went on to run his own management consulting firm, help found a commune in New Mexico, and teach at universities. He has just released his book on consciousness with co-author Jordan Gruber, entitled Your Symphony of Selves: Discover and Understand More of Who We Are. From his initial rediscovery of microdosing and developing a protocol based on early reports, Dr. Fadiman teamed up with Dr. Sophia Korb to record the microdosing experiences of several thousand individuals from 51 countries. In this episode, Dr. Fadiman, who you'll hear me call Jim per his request, answers the questions that you all submitted through Instagram and plantmedicine.org. So I wanted to acknowledge and thank everyone who took part in making this episode the fantastic collaboration that it turned out to be. Now, before we get to Dr. Fadiman, just a reminder that the Plant Medicine Podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. Nothing here is to be construed as medical advice. And one last thing, I have a very special announcement. In the coming weeks, we are launching the Psychedelic Medicine Association. The goal of the Psychedelic Medicine Association is to educate our frontline medical providers on what's going on in the psychedelic science world. I'm a Western-trained doctor. I know that the majority of my classmates and colleagues have not been aware of what's been going on with MDMA and psilocybin and ayahuasca and all the research that we know is showing to be very helpful in areas where other therapeutics have not been. And once these medicines are FDA approved, like MDMA and psilocybin, it doesn't help getting them to patients unless those patients' doctors know that they exist. And so that is where the Psychedelic Medicine Association comes in. Its goal is to educate people who are on the front lines of patient care, those that patients first go to when they're having any kind of issue, on the types of therapies that are currently available and that are going to become available soon, and the best practices regarding those therapeutics. So if you are a medical professional of any kind working with patients, please head over to the psychedelicmedicineassociation.org and sign up so that we can give you information as it becomes available. And if you could please also share it with your colleagues, those who may not be familiar with psychedelics, because it's all part of the process of educating providers throughout the world so that we can get the best patient care as these therapies become available. Now, without further ado, Dr. James Fadiman. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jim.
It's really a pleasure to be here.
It's an absolute honor for me to have you on, and for all of our listeners who have written in questions, I know they're very excited about this conversation we're going to have. I have to start by thanking our mutual friend, Dr. Robert Weitzel, for connecting us.
Obviously, he's one of the more wonderful people I've come across in all this work.
He really is. And if people have not heard his episode on the Plant Medicine Podcast, scroll way back. He has the psilocybin practitioner episode. It's fascinating. He is a fascinating individual. I highly recommend anybody who gets the chance to meet and speak with him to do so, because you're right. There's just like few gems of humans like Robert Weitzel.
But he does suggest what's possible for humans.
He does. And when you hear his backstory and just how many things he has accomplished and overcome, he's just next level. And I thoroughly appreciate that one day he reached out and he's like, I think you should have Jim Fadiman on. And I said, well, Robert, that would be a total honor. And he said, okay, hold on, texting. And I was like, oh boy. So very grateful to Robert. All right, we're going to get started. We're going to do this in Q&A format, but at the end, we're going to chat a little bit about your new book called Your Symphony of Selves that you wrote with Jordan Gruber. Am I pronouncing his name right?
You're just perfectly.
Okay, perfect. But yeah, I'm looking forward to that chat about that. So we are going to start. We have a wide range of listeners. We're going to start with just a few basic questions. I know they could find these from your website, but just in case they haven't checked it out, we're going to go through a few basics and then get into a little bit more specifics.
Okay.
All right. We're going to start with what constitutes a microdose and mostly here we're talking about LSD and psilocybin. And there were a number who asked if there was a formula where they needed to factor in their height and their weight when they're deciding that dose.
Okay, let's do the answer, and we'll get to it with height and weight, is no.
Okay, great.
But we'll go backwards now to how do we get there, which is a microdose is should be, by the way the word is designed, a little tiny bit. So it actually is a 10th or a 20th of what's called in the wider world of drug use a recreational dose. When we get down to numbers, and I'll use LSD and psilocybin, it's approximately between 7 and 12 micrograms of LSD. We originally, some years ago, said 10 micrograms. But of the several thousand people who wrote in reports on their use, a number of them said it should be a little less. And a very small number said it should be a little more. So this is actually almost everything I'm going to say is from reports of people about their own experiences. This is not theory. This is not rigid science. This is all citizen science from around the world. So back to doses. For LSD, approximately 7 to 12 micrograms, think 10. And for psilocybin mushrooms, 0.1 to 0.4 grams. And again, that's down from where we were a few years ago based on people's experience. A microdose, if it's correct dose, you will not have any psychedelic effect. This is almost how you define it, which is no visions, no snakes eating you alive, no incredible breakthroughs of repressed terrible things in your life that you didn't want to face. Usually not much in terms of grand insights. But as we go on, it's a whole different family of effects. It's not a small version. So this is not a little tiny psychedelic trip, not at all. It's something quite different.
Got it. And I love that explanation, because I think if somebody has not microdosed before, they may be expecting, like you said, just a pared down version, but it's a completely separate type of experience.
Right.
What schedule do you recommend people follow?
Well, I developed a protocol, as it's called, which is taking it on day 1 and then not taking anything on day 2 and not taking anything on day 3 and then taking it again on day 4. That's a cycle. And what I've asked people to do, and that's where all these thousands of reports came from, is to do that over a month. That's about 10 cycles. And at that point, people should know their own bodies and their own systems well enough to decide what would be correct in the future. And what we found, and this was surprising to us, is most people report to us they use microdoses less than that after the month. They use it once a week, or they use it for special occasions, and some people just keep on with that protocol. Now, why 3 days? Well, first day is obviously there's an effect of the substance. The second day, it turns out, there's an afterglow, which is pretty much the same as the first day. Many people say the second day is even better. The third day, when I was designing this, was so you would return to your baseline, so you would experience the difference of having it or not, and then the fourth day you would be able to investigate it all over again. But it turned out after about 30 days, people were saying that pattern of 1 day on and 2 days off seemed to work perfectly well for them, and that they didn't need to take it more often.
And after those 30 days, when people would stop, would they redo that 10 cycle?
No, they would pretty much do whatever they thought worked best for them. It's more like what's the correct portion of food, it's obviously individual. And there also is another protocol out there from Paul Stamets, who knows more about mushrooms than anybody in the universe. And he suggests taking it for 5 days and then taking 2 days off. And we don't have enough reports so that we know the difference, though Paul and I actually have a study going where people decide which protocol they're going to take. And our guess between us is there won't be that much difference.
Interesting. So yours would essentially be more cost effective.
Exactly. I accuse Paul of he has his protocol because he has access to more mushrooms.
True. I like that.
Oh, wait. Let's go back to weight and whatever it was, age.
Oh, yeah. Weight and age. Weight and height.
Right. Well, it turns out, imagine you're standing there and you weigh 100 male here, 175 pounds. You now then, for reasons only known to you, you either beef up or get fat. You now weigh 275 pounds. How much bigger is your brain? It turns out it's actually the same size. So if you're taking a substance which predominantly affects your brain, height and weight have nothing to do with it. Now, that was the way I was talking for many years and getting snarls from some of my psychodynamic, pharmacological friends. But fortunately, somebody actually did an article where they compared studies which did give a varied dose depending on weight versus studies that didn't. And what's wonderful in psychedelic science is you can now do research, and what they found out is there was no difference. So unless your brain is changing weight very rapidly, and also what we're talking about such small amounts that all those issues, which usually are based on, when you have the issues of things changing depending on your weight, we're usually talking about unnecessary and unwanted side effects. With microdosing, that's just not an issue.
All right. Well, thank you for clearing that up for us. The question that I think came up maybe the next most often was, do antidepressants like SSRIs make microdosing less effective?
The answer is probably not. Now, the probably, as was said very slowly. What we know is that many people take microdosing to help them get off of SSRIs that are no longer working. So that our depression group are people who are, there's a wonderful term called treatment resistant. It's like it's your fault. But these are people who have taken a number of antidepressants over the years, and each one might have worked for a while, might not. But they're caught between it no longer working and they can't get off it because of terrible side effects when you withdraw too quickly. So a lot of people have found that when they're tapering off of an SSRI, which means taking it down very, very slowly over a period maybe a couple of months from full dose to zero, that microdosing helps that, makes it easier, makes it maybe even a little faster. So people who are on SSRIs successfully usually don't show up and have an interest in microdosing. And probably it would be a little less effective, but we really don't know.
Okay. And I know that you had mentioned that at your website, there's a place where people can check for interactions with different
Yep. Yeah, we
pharmaceuticals,
have
correct?
a list of 180 substances,
Wow.
pharmaceuticals, herbs, all kinds of things. Now, these are all from reports of people that said, I'm on such and such, and I was able to microdose effectively and successfully. So, on the other list of substances that we know may cause a problem, there's one, which is lithium carbonate. And lithium is used for fairly severe mental disturbance. I don't like to use diagnostic labels. Um, and we had one case where someone wrote in and said, I'm on lithium, I microdosed, and then there was a list of terrible things. So we said, stop, and that took care of it. But then we put up a warning about lithium. And we've had some other people taking lithium who reported no problems. But we don't recommend people on lithium microdose.
Okay. Good to know. And while we're on that, let's discuss what, if any, are some other contraindications to
Well, my
microdosing.
favorite, because it just begs for some fun research, is that people who have red-green color blindness, when they microdose, they have tracers. Now, anyone in your audience who's had higher dose psychedelic experiences knows what a tracer is, but it's an after effect of looking at a bright light source. You look at a light, and as you turn your head away, the bright light is still in your visual field. You also see it when you have a sparkler at night, and it has like a little trail of light behind it. That's a tracer. And what people say is it's very irritating because you microdose, and then for several days later you have tracers. And I have a couple of reports that said, yeah, I have tracers, but the benefits are worth it. So again, we don't recommend it for red-green colorblind folks.
Okay.
Now, I know that was a pretty short list. Oh, the other one that's a little more important is if you have a symptom of anxiety, not depression and anxiety, just anxiety, microdosing may or may not be a good idea. The problem, what we've gotten a lot of reports, is when the people microdose, they either genuinely have more anxiety or they're more aware of their anxiety. So we don't recommend it for people whose desire is to deal only with anxiety.
Good to know. What about, I had seen something about people on the autism
Oh,
spectrum.
yes. Well, you have to understand that we're trying to do something like conventional research findings, even though we're getting our data unconventionally. And the people on the autism scale, the high-functioning people, they say, I took 10 micrograms, nothing. I took 20, nothing. Around 50 micrograms, I had the effects that other people have with 10 micrograms. So what we said to them is, honestly, we're exploring this very low-dose area, and you just don't fit in the study. We don't know whether they went on to do whatever they did, but we found that they, for some reason, report that the effects only come on at a higher dose. Oh, and let's cover the other group, which is pregnancy.
Okay.
There's no evidence one way or another, even anecdotal, but in general, the rule of thumb in pregnancy is don't. That's don't practically about everything.
And I think you'd also mentioned in the webinar I had seen with you breastfeeding.
Yes. Again, we've had questions about can I microdose and breastfeed, and again, our question is the reason makes perfect sense, and what we've said is if you wait 5 or 6 hours between microdosing and breastfeeding, there should be no difficulty, and we've never had a negative report from people who breastfed while microdosing. Again, we're talking about something that has much less effects than everyone imagines. There's a book out called A Really Good Day, and it's by Elliot Waldman, and it's about her own use of microdosing. And the definition that she comes up with is if you have microdosed, what you notice is that you're working a little more effectively, you are comfortable taking cold calls, you're actually a little kinder to the person who doesn't deserve it, If you go to the gym, you do one more set of reps, and you've forgotten that you took a microdose.
I like that description. I think it's very accurate. One more category I wanted to ask about was those who have psychotic disorders.
Yeah, there's a general rule of thumb in all psychedelic research is you don't take people into your study who've had prior mental breakdowns and who have a current diagnosis of one of the various serious mental conditions like bipolar and schizophrenic. And that's done because there would be complications at high doses. And I thought, I wonder if we know anything actually about that. If we don't take these people in, how do we know that? So I wrote one of the major researchers has about 35 years experience, and I said, is there any evidence? And I got back a few papers, and the answer is no, because we never take them into these studies because it kind of seems sensible. And I'd say for high doses, it's absolutely sensible, especially if you're doing research and you don't want to get blamed if somebody has a mental breakdown later. I did look up bipolar for a while because there's some wonderful sites online of people who are bipolar talking to each other. And what they've said is you can microdose when you're depressed, but you shouldn't microdose when you're manic. Now, they've not been part of our study, and I'm only quoting from that incredible resource of the online communities, and that makes sense to me.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That when I heard you say that in the webinar, I thought, oh, obviously, like it could definitely have benefits to the lows, but if it's kind of had a stimulating effect on people, even minor, then those in the manic era may not need that extra boost. Before we move on, I wanted to pop in your website here so that if anybody is like, where did I check for interactions with the pharmaceuticals? That's at microdosingpsychedelics.com, correct?
Correct. Yeah, and there's a little tab that says questions, drug interactions.
Okay, perfect. Going down this list, we've talked about contraindications. Are there any risks or adverse effects that you know of?
Well, it's a curious thing, and when you're doing this kind of research, you actually want to find adverse effects, because if you ever should say this is good for almost everyone, then all your scientific colleagues say you're a bad person. And if you look carefully at a lot of the studies, there are some wonderful studies, and they always have something that went wrong with at least one subject. So it's almost necessary. So my favorite was someone that wrote in and had a number of incredible difficult things: stomach, headaches, pain. And I wrote back and said, I think you should stop microdosing. And he wrote back and he said, you can't make me stop microdosing just because I have these difficulties. And I wrote back and said, as a researcher, I have to tell you to stop microdosing. As a person, I wish you'd stop microdosing. And he wrote back and said, I cut the dose in half and all the symptoms went away. So we don't know about, again, it's when people have negative experiences, and I'm sure some people have, they don't continue. So it's hard to get much evidence. I did have one wonderful compulsive graduate student who was incredibly depressed, and also she was in philosophy, so she also was existentially depressed and anxious, and she had more unhappiness with microdosing than usual, and kept at it. She was determined to go through a 30-day cycle, which she did, and it was all unhappiness. And there was no way I could prevent her from continuing. So the rule of thumb with microdosing, it's a little bit like a food you haven't experienced. If you like it, you'll probably have it again, and if you don't like it, you'll stop. This is very different. You see, remember, high dose is like getting on the roller coaster, and at the top of the second hill, you say, I don't think I want to do this anymore. You can't do that. But microdosing is a kind of gentler, it's more like having a chocolate after dinner. You can really have decision power from the onset.
Yes, I understand. And along those same lines, if somebody is taking it for a while, when, if ever, does tolerance show up? And is there an optimal approach to avoiding development of tolerance?
Psychedelics are very peculiar. They're anti-addictive, which is if you take, now we'll talk high dose because we know more. If you take a high dose, a couple of hundred micrograms on Monday, and you have an incredible breakthrough and God speaks to you and you know you're part of all beings, and you think, I want to do that again. So Tuesday you take the same dose and God talks to you but in a very low whisper and you can't hear him. And Wednesday you take it and God says, what are you back here for? And basically you have no effect. So that's tolerance, meaning the brain in some sense says we need to regroup in some way from this very high dose experience. The notion in microdosing is by taking it once every 3 days, if there is tolerance, you won't ever experience it. And people, I do have one study of someone who took it every day for a month and had been sufficiently clinically depressed that according to him he was on federal disability. And for a month he was himself, he was happy, he was productive, he was social, and then wherever he'd gotten it ran out, and over a period of a couple of weeks he said he reverted back to his depressed state. But he did not have tolerance for that month, but I think tolerance does exist, and it's simply prudent not to dose every day.
Understand. Another question that came up is there a difference between using psilocybin for your microdoses and using LSD?
There are 2 points of view. One is no, which is where I am, because we can't find any real distinctions that hold up when we start analyzing data. And the other is a lot of people feel there is. And a wonderful man in Los Angeles said in his community of microdosers, there was general agreement that LSD was somewhat more analytic and that psilocybin was somewhat more emotional or personal. And I pass that on to you as information that we don't know much about. The difference normally between psilocybin and LSD is only in terms of hours of acute activity, which is LSD is an 8 to 12 hour event and psilocybin is a 4 to 7 hour event. But when you're looking at taking it every 3 days and you're looking at days 1 and 2 being 48 hours, that difference washes out.
Understand. And did I also hear that you had no reports of nausea with LSD? Is that one of the other small differences?
Oh, yes. Sometimes people with psilocybin, remember they're taking a mushroom, which has in it other things other than psilocybin and other than psilocybin and a couple of other wonderful psychochemicals. And some people have reported a little bit of stomach upset for an hour or two. And no one does that with LSD.
Okay, got it. Now, speaking of what may be in with these psilocybin compounds, I had multiple people ask about your thoughts on mixing ashwagandha with, and when they write this in, I'm assuming they're talking about psilocybin, but they were talking about mixing ashwagandha and niacin. They had questions about those two, and then they asked if there were other medicinal mushrooms you recommended adding in.
Okay, Paul Stamets' formula is psilocybin, lion's mane, and niacin. The niacin, according to Paul, makes the psilocybin work more effectively. The lion's mane is because that makes your mind work more effectively. That's Paul's formula. There's another group operating out of Europe where truffles are legal called Flow State, and they have a proprietary mix of a couple of mushrooms with the psilocybin, and I think without the niacin. since these mushrooms are fundamentally good for you, it's not clear. Basically, that's what we know. And a lot of people feel that the mushroom psilocybin mix is better. And when I say they feel it feels better, that's about the level of data we have. So it sounds to me like it's generally a good idea in the same realm of you should have a good breakfast.
Right. I appreciate that. I had some other people ask about combining cannabis and CBD with microdosing.
Sometimes I look at Reddit, and Reddit has a sub-edit on microdosing.
Okay.
And that sub-edit has over 100,000 members.
Wow.
So there's a lot of chat about taking everything with everything. And in general, the comment I think I've been getting is smoking cannabis with microdosing doesn't seem to improve either. It's not harmful, but it's a from my point of view, it kind of wastes a little bit of the microdose effectiveness.
Especially if you're having maybe a sedative form of cannabis, right?
Yeah, and CBD is generally good with everything.
That does seem to be the trend, doesn't it? I like that.
It's hard to find anybody who's saying, I took CBD and something got worse.
Right. Very true. Good point. There's a question on, and you have brought this up a few times, but what, if any, research exists on microdosing? Outside of your study.
I used to be able to have a very easy answer, which was none, except that we had a couple of thousand cases. But as a result of our kind of making some of our data available, there's a series of studies. A number of them have been questionnaires, which is, hello out there, if you've used microdosing, would you fill in this questionnaire? Would you take some psychological tests? There was a very nice study out of Australia of people taking some tests before and after microdosing. There's a lovely study in Holland where at the beginning of the evening you took a couple of tests of cognitive facility, kind of different ways in which your brain worked. Then you took a microdose, and then there was an evening talk, and then afterwards you took the same tests again. And they reported that certain kinds of cognitive creativity functions improved and some didn't. The general trend from all the research is not dissimilar, shouldn't be, than ours, which is most people who microdose feel it's beneficial. Now, notice that if you're only asking people who microdose, they're undoubtedly going to be heavily, heavily skewed to ones that like it.
Yes. Because
the ones that either don't like it don't show up on these surveys, and of course, we're not at the place where you can do a general sample of the world to see what's the percentage of people who are microdosing.
Right. And it's hard to, I think I saw somewhere in either one of your books or somewhere else that it's hard to get FDA approval or whoever approves the IRB approval to give somebody a Schedule I substance and then let them go about their business, which is what microdosing requires doing.
Right. So there are a couple of studies which are actually, one of them at least is proposed to get what's called real-world evidence. But since we've been doing real-world evidence for 5 years, we think it's a good idea because and this is from the conventional pharmacological literature, you don't know that your substance has any real value until you get it out of the research and into clients, so when your physician hands you a new antidepressant or stimulant or cholesterol lowering, that's the test of whether it works. And unfortunately, that data isn't usually picked up by the company that makes the product. Now, with microdosing, we're really getting a lot better long-range research than a lot of pharmaceuticals have gotten. But again, we're obviously limited to people who think it has enough benefit to take it long enough to give us information.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So I think I should make it clear that I'm an enthusiast for the effects of microdosing, but I never recommend that anyone microdose. That's a personal decision based on information. But the nice thing is the risk-reward ratio, which is how dangerous versus how beneficial, is very good for microdosing. Meaning, if you take it, it's very low risk. And from the reports we have, a lot of possibility of benefits. If you're taking a high dose, the risks go way up.
Yeah.
And the benefits also go up, but it's a different ratio.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Speaking of those benefits, before we get into using microdose to address certain conditions, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the wide range of effects that people can experience with microdosing, for example, just with healthy normals.
Right. Well, the nice thing about microdosing with healthy normals is they have a whole different range of interests. If you're taking a substance for pain and it has a side effect, and this is very common in certain opioids, of constipation, if it alleviates your pain, you may not even report the constipation.
Right.
But when you're, quote, a healthy normal, and you're taking it for energy, for creativity, for other uses, you really pay attention, and you notice other things that are unrelated to your desire. So the main use of it is actually in healthy normals, as far as I can tell. When I look at the kind of world use, and if you read a certain amount of the press, both respectable and fringe, the use of people in normal daily life is extensive. The use of it with students for improving their academic capacity. The use, and we'll look at some of those as we go. But and then you have to say, well, why is it good for normals and it's also good for people with specific conditions? And then you get, well, what's really going on? And certainly we don't know, but it looks like it improves the overall functioning of the system. And the best image I have is when you have a car, and it runs pretty well, and you take it into the dealer and you get a tune-up. Now, during the tune-up, the car doesn't get any new parts. It will get some different lubrication, and it'll get things, the tolerances between parts will be made much clearer and closer. And when you then drive it away, it'll drive better. That's a tune-up. And therefore, tuning your car up improves functioning of all parts. And that looks like a better metaphor for what microdosing does, because it seems to improve functioning in ways that people had no particular interest, which is, I guess one might call it a positive side effect. And here's the example. People say, gee, I have been taking microdosing for a month, and I'm not as depressed, but I also noticed that I'm sleeping better. I'm using less alcohol. This is now generalizing over a lot of people. Less cannabis, less coffee, and I notice my diet has improved. I'm also doing either more exercise, more meditation, and none of those, you see, were on their list of why they were taking it. And that probably is among the more interesting findings. So we're looking at something that improves the system, because all of those alcohol, uppers and downers, alcohol, weed, and so forth, are because you feel a need for it or a desire, not that it isn't a pleasure, but when you realize that you don't feel the imbalance necessary to take it, that's a very different feeling. So that's one of the things we're looking at, and it's more like a vitamin than anything else, because nobody says, I'm only taking a vitamin for this one medical condition. A vitamin improves the whole system.
Right. Right. I think you discuss how it brings you into this equilibrium that
Yeah.
like you said, if you're not down and you're not high, you don't need alcohol or cannabis or a stimulant to get you back to baseline.
Right.
Okay, well, thank you for that description. And by the way, just one of the sentences I love from Psychedelic Explorer's Guide was the person who described his microdosing as slightly rearranging his neural furniture. That was just a fantastic little image, but he had said that he had like glimmers of full-on psychedelic states kind of constantly pouring in. And I can see where that, like, okay, suddenly I'm a little nicer, or man, I've got a little more energy, or I feel a little more loving in that moment. That sounds a little bit like what you described. It's just it turns up these little things.
And what notice is that the adjective you used is correct, which is a little.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when people recover from some major things, it's not little, but most of what we're talking about, and we'll get to, some heavy issues later, but most of the things that are reported are, I'm a little.
Yeah. But sometimes that's the little boost people need.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, if you're only one stair from the top of the stair, all you need is one step.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Well, that's a perfect segue into talking about these slightly more serious conditions. Can you tell us the effects of somebody who is in a more depressed state?
Yeah. Probably over half of our sample, and I should mention it's from 51 countries, so we really have a pretty good sample, and ranging, I think our oldest person was in their 90s. But maybe half or more had reported depression. And as you know, if you kind of into the mental health world, that depression is, the disease that everybody's been getting more of. And that's not the same as sadness. Right now, with economics and COVID and a lot of other things, if you're not sad about the real world, you're kind of missing something.
Yeah.
Depressed is when things are going well and you feel just as bad.
Yes.
What we've found is that about 80% of the people who come in with heavy depression, and again, most of them having failed medications or other therapies, we have about an 80% turnaround rate where they're not depressed.
Wow.
That's really striking.
Yes.
And what we see, and this is something that Sophia teased out of our data, when you are taking an antidepressant and it's working, what it really does is it makes negative experiences and feelings more bearable. So you don't hurt as much. And when people complain about their antidepressants, usually the complaint is that they feel numb. They feel flat.
Yeah.
Now, what happens with microdosing is that those same effect as an SSRI, which is the negative experiences are felt less painfully. So you feel less bad. However, the difference is if you look at the positive expressions, positive feelings, those go up. So you are feeling not only less bad, but more good. And that's very, very different than what the pharmaceuticals are capable of doing. And that's what happens. So the depressed people, very often the comment is, I feel like myself again. Or I'm back. Or I have my feelings back. And I have a very old friend who, after 31 years of being on antidepressants, and he was on 2 different ones when he wrote and asked about microdosing, he tapered off one and then tapered off the other. It took about 6 months. And he said, I don't know quite what to do with all these feelings. I haven't had them for so long. And he said, I'm embarrassing people because I cry more when I'm happy and when I'm sad. He said, it's just wonderful.
Oh, I love that. Thank you for sharing that story. Closely related to those who are having issues with depression, sometimes they're also having issues with sleep. And I had a number of people ask if microdosing can help with sleep and if it affects sleep in a way that you should time your microdose if it's going to impact.
We recommend you should, if you're going to microdose, do it before 10 in the morning, because it might affect sleep because it has certainly a slight stimulant effect. And what we found is a lot of people, their sleep cycle improves because of microdosing. But again, they're taking it early in the day. And some people have said, yeah, I sometimes microdose at night and I have incredible dreams. But we don't recommend it. Two reasons. One is its major benefits are in your waking life. And again, we don't recommend something that might keep you awake. So this is, consider it like a mild stimulant in terms of issues of sleep. But again, if you've had a healthier day, you're more likely to have a healthier night.
That makes sense. Okay, good to know. Microdose before 10 a.m. All right. The next one is one of my favorites because I had never thought of this until I heard you bring it up in the webinar, but people had reported that it was helpful for PMS.
Oh, yeah. See, what's wonderful with microdosing is we're finding things that, of course, nobody in the high-dose psychedelic world, where I was for decades, ever thought of it. Because it wasn't where we were looking.
Yeah.
And we have a small group of not subjects, of people who sent us reports that their PMS has been either totally alleviated or vastly improved. And this is both for emotional and physical. And we haven't been able to research it much farther than that. We did turn over the data to research people who are researching PMS. And what they said is, well, some of your people, there's a lot of different reasons for PMS, and looks like microdosing helps some of them, but we can't tell which. And so the thing that's curious is our first subject who wrote me and said, I know I owe you a report, but I thought you'd be interested in this. And she said, since I was microdosing in that month, that was the first time I'd ever had a normal period. And I wrote back and said, what are you doing now? And she said, nothing. I only microdose that 1 month, but my periods are normal. Now, we have other people who say, I microdose, well, we have one that says, I only microdose a few days before my period. So we don't really know what's going on, but we know for PMS, it has shown improvement in a large enough group that I can share that with you.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm sure there are many people out there that appreciate that because it is something that I had never heard discussed before and an issue that affects so many. So thank you for sharing your findings on that. Let's move on to something that you had hinted at before when we were talking about academic performance, but can you talk a little bit about microdoses' effects on those with ADHD?
We have some reports that say it's been very helpful. Now, we have a lot of reports of people that say they're able to pay attention in school more. They're not necessarily saying they had a diagnosable problem. But I'm thinking of one remarkable young woman who said that once she got interested in psychedelics in high school and started microdosing, that she wrote something about psychedelics in 6 classes. And then when she got to college, she realized that with microdosing she could stay focused and that she did have ADHD and that and she's now like a Class A student and also a research associate, a research assistant as an undergraduate, and doing splendidly. So that's just one I've followed. But in general, we have a lot of people who've said, I was using Adderall. Adderall is probably, my guess is like 80% of the Adderall is off-label, used by students. And the problem, and they say, gee, this is like very much like Adderall, except with none of the very disturbing side effects. Adderall includes crashing, by the way, and addiction. So it may be it has been used in a lot of academic settings for improved attention and focus. And one report said, "I can now listen even to the most boring professor." And that's really a remarkable shift in ability to focus.
It really is. That's a huge advancement. If that's the thing keeping you from learning, is just that kind of boredom that comes with the Ferris Bueller level professor, then I can imagine that would have a significant effect on their on their grades.
And if I were a boring professor, I might, suggest my students take it. But we will not go there.
I like it. All right, let's move on to a category. I know we have a lot of veterans who listen to this show and other people from sports, et cetera, that may have experience with traumatic brain injury or TBI. Is there any talk about microdoses' effect on that?
Yeah. At the MAPS event in 2017, it was like 3,000 researchers in one building. Several people came up to me and said that since they've been microdosing, their symptoms of TBI has lessened. These are all people who'd had just one major brain injury, and they had had lots of treatment. And at some point, when you're in that brain injury world, you're the people saying, "This is as much as we can do for you." So these are all people post-treatment, and a number of them reported something, and I just put it away. And then I've been getting reports more recently from one of the underground scientists who's been working with professional athletes who have been retired because of excessive concussions. And I've read some of the reports from those athletes, and they feel re-energized, less pain, less inertia, kind of feeling back towards normality. So it's what we're very starting to look at, and it's an extraordinary possibility because the problem with brain trauma is there's really not much they can do for you.
Yeah.
Because we don't have anything that, quote, repairs brains.
Right.
But what we do know about microdosing, and this is in the journal Cell, that's CELL, it's not an advertising journal, that literally individual neurons in the laboratory exposed to microdoses grow into more healthy, more complex neurons with more dendrites, meaning more communication capacity. And it's what is called neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to repair itself. And it looks like that may be what's happening with the TBI people, but we honestly have no idea.
Wow, that's fascinating. We're definitely going to look that up and put that in the show notes. That's very cool that they have tested that. Like you said, neuroplasticity and neuroregeneration are big issues that have been hard to tackle beforehand.
Yep.
Wow. And on that same area, we had somebody write in and ask about whether there have been any findings regarding microdosing and dementia or Alzheimer's.
When people have written us and asked, is it okay to give microdoses to my, and then they fill in the name of the relative and the condition, my ethical kind of condition, Sophia is usually much more ethical than I am, but even on this one I'm ethical, which is I don't feel comfortable with recommending or even approving you're giving something to someone who may not know what they're getting.
Yeah.
And we have a couple, of course, remarkable stories. One, a 5-year-old, and again, we don't recommend giving it to children at all, but a 5-year-old was given some by a parent, and the report was, this is severe autism, this is low on the scale. He's hitting his head less often on the floor, and his vocabulary is much larger.
Wow.
So that's exactly that. See, what that does is say, let's look there.
Yeah.
Because there may be something there.
Yeah.
And there was research with high doses and very, very, very deeply disturbed children, totally institutionalized children, 50 years ago. And the one beautiful story from that research was one of the children walked over to the researcher who's sitting there quietly watching children who have had a lot of LSD, and she puts her hand on his knee, looks up, she's maybe about 7, and says, "We're all one, aren't we?"
Oh.
Exactly. And he says yes. Now, what's interesting, she hadn't spoken for like 2 years.
Oh, wow.
But that's high dose.
Okay.
So we're looking at that because we have enough positive reports that it's worth investigating.
Got it. Good to know. Staying with the same neurologic theme, what have you all found regarding migraines and cluster headaches?
Now, that one's easier. Migraines look pretty good. We have a number of reports that people's migraines decline in number and intensity. Now, notice I didn't say they go away.
Yeah.
But the drop is often around 90%. And the story that makes it clear for me is this is a woman who was married to a holistic physician, so she'd really tried everything.
Yeah.
And she wrote me and she said, "I had a migraine last month. It lasted 36 hours." And I wrote, a little condolence. And she wrote back and she said, "No, I used to have like 20 of them a month."
Wow.
So what we've found is for migraines, on the whole, a reduction, but not certainly elimination. And if you go into the research on migraines, we used to have a really good theory, which wasn't true. And I think right now we're between theories for cause, so we don't really know what's going on. Cluster headaches, and this is very important. Anyone who's listening, it's clusterbusters.org. That's one word, clusterbusters. That's the group that knows the most. And they have pioneered the use of high doses for clusters with incredible success. We have some reports of people who've microdosed for clusters successfully, and these are people who've only written us afterwards, because when anyone writes us and say, "Should I use this for clusters?" I say, on the whole, probably you need to go to Cluster Busters, and it may be high doses.
Got it.
So, and there is a research project, I believe, starting up finally now, looking at psychedelics and clusters.
Yeah, I saw that. That's exciting. I'm very much looking for, I'm sure people with cluster headaches are even very much more looking forward to the results of that study.
Well, the Cluster Busters really will be very important to them because they also give you ways. There are certain plants that you can buy that are legal, which you can distill enough psychedelic out for cluster busting. And for those of you that don't know, cluster headaches are the single most painful event known to human beings. And even worse, for a number of people, they're called episodic, which means they happen on a regular schedule. And they're also called suicide headaches because the suicide rate among people with clusters is like 20 times the general average.
Wow. I didn't know it was that high. That's incredible.
Yeah, I was so excited to realize that high doses could help them. And I was at a Cluster Buster conference, and I asked someone, in my naive way, who'd taken a massive dose of psilocybin to end a cluster. I said, "What was the experience like?" And he looked at me and he said, "I couldn't care less. I just wanted the pain to be gone."
And had it worked for him?
Yeah.
Oh, nice. So interesting. All right, we will definitely put that in the notes as well, as if somebody could forget Cluster Buster, but we'll still put it in the notes. We've got two last questions. First, somebody wrote in and asked, was there any evidence from your study linking microdosing with increased athletic performance?
Well, I kind of say this quietly because athletes are beginning to know about it. And the answer is yes. And my favorite, there's a wonderful article that I love to reference when I write an article because the headline includes the phrase, "and whooped his ass." And it's a judo gentleman who does judo. And what he says in his description is before microdosing, he would get silver medals, and since microdosing, he gets gold.
Wow.
So that's the kind of obvious. And we have a lot of different sports, a lot of collegiate sports where people made the team, people did better, pressed more weight, various things like that. And if you think about it, if it improves cognitive functioning and focus, it's likely that it will improve kind of muscle tone and reactivity. And we also know from indigenous people that if you're in a hunting society, microdoses are very useful because they improve not only your physical stamina, but your focus.
Oh.
And the one that I actually like, which is quite different, this was college volleyball. And he said, I'm not sure I played any better, but I could feel what the whole team was doing, and so I could anticipate. Basically, my strategy improved. I could do what the team needed to do much better than I had before.
Huh. I like that because that's kind of expanding on multiple levels. There's like a cohesive awareness and focus with a little bit of extra stamina. And then like you had mentioned, if microdose gives you that extra oomph to do, like you said, one more set at the gym, then cumulatively I can imagine that would have a beneficial outcome to athletic performance.
And I have also a half marathoner who records his time every day and who runs maybe 5 or 6 miles a day just for practice. And he agreed that he would microdose for his next race.
Oh. Has this already taken place?
Yeah. And this is a half marathon. This is not a professional athlete, but someone who's run a number of marathons over the years. And he indicated that his time was better than it had been since 10 years earlier.
Wow.
And for those of you who run, it was 20 minutes faster.
Well,
and in the running world, that usually gets a out of these people.
That's significant. In the one half marathon I've done, I know that's a significant amount. Wow, very cool. Well, that gives our athletes out there something to think about. The last question I absolutely adore that somebody had sent in, and this person asked, what are some best practices for mental health and medical providers to support people who are currently microdosing?
Well, what's wonderful about the question, it's taken from the high dose world where you need people.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, there's a wonderful article by a psychotherapist, I believe in Los Angeles, who says, I don't recommend microdosing to my patients, but I let them know it exists. And I like it when they have microdosed before they come into therapy because we move much faster. Okay.
Nice.
And I thought, wow, I'm amazed that we're in a world where you can write such a thing and sign your name. This is not anonymous.
Oh, really?
And a lot of people write us that they go over this with their therapist, particularly if they're using it to taper off pharmaceuticals. And a lot of therapists who also microdose obviously feel fine about it. So you don't need a mental health professional to guide you. There is actually kind of a second generation of microdosing, which says coaching is valuable, individual coaching is better. Again, the work of the Microdose Institute in the Netherlands doesn't sell psychedelics. It sells microdoses plus consultation and coaching.
Okay.
And Paul Austin teaches a course. There are courses, and I thought when they first started, I said, what do you have to do? How can you make a course out of taking something that has the, less toxicity than an aspirin? And the answer is that people benefit from understanding more and better, and that my general notion of giving you dose levels and giving you a protocol, but all of that, of course, is flexible, and different people have different needs. So the answer is you don't need someone, and there are professionals arising who will help you.
Got it. Got it. Yes. Paul and I were actually discussing this recently about that exactly thing. The thing you brought up is, what about when people take, because we were discussing like legality issues, but what about when people take their microdose and they come in for their therapy as the provider, what is your legal responsibility in knowing that? And that's a whole new realm of people, of things for people to get in that are in this area. So I think that's another best practice that we will save for another conversation on this podcast, a legal focused one.
Well, hopefully you'll get a psychologist and psychiatrist who do talk about their legal obligations, because it's a curious question. In therapy, what is your client allowed to talk about anything, which they say they are, but they're not really allowed to talk about certain things, or your therapist has to follow rules. Now, the major rule is if they talk about suicide, you have to do something about it. Mm-hmm. But my guess is that for clients who are using illegal substances, ones that are bad for you and ones that are good for you, that most therapists probably don't make a practice of turning them in.
Right.
And the only reason I say that is because I know of no cases.
Correct. And I think you're absolutely right on that. I think Paul's question was, and it was something I had not thought of before, and I was glad he brought up to me, is what's the legality of that person who signed their name to it actually knowing that person is going to be using it before coming in, and essentially through omission of a admonishment, kind of being tacitly accepting of that practice.
Well, I think it's if you're a therapist and you've used something successfully, for you not to tell your patients is a tricky problem.
Yes.
Okay, I mean, you say to your patients, "Hey, I read this great book on anxiety, and you have anxiety. I think you'd like it."
Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Hey, I've found that by not drinking Coca-Colas all day, my blood pressure goes down, and yours would probably too. And the fact that psychedelics are illegal, the thing that's interesting, it was an early study, one of these questionnaire studies. What's the major problem with microdosing? And the major problem in that study was that it was illegal.
Yeah.
But they did they did another study, and they had a world sample. There's something called the World Drug Questionnaire put out by a British newspaper, and they got a question into this year's on microdosing. And out of the 180,000 people worldwide who filled in this very long questionnaire on all kinds of drugs that you've never heard of and ones that you know, it included microdosing. And they had about 6,000 people who'd microdosed, and they had asked them, again, that question, and the illegality question went away. It was not important. It was maybe 9th or 10th on issues. And I think it's because the awareness of doing a self-beneficial act that seems to cause no harm to anyone and is not very expensive and so forth, people are used to it. We've had psychedelics have been illegal for a couple of generations, so people have grown up with, oh, yeah, that's illegal. And if you go on Reddit and you listen, you read some of the things of what people are taking, it's this laundry list of every illegal drug you've ever heard of. I'm just astounded at the availability.
Right. I remember that being reported as one of the negatives of microdosing was just that they could not get access to it.
Well, I think that's a very negative. It's like
Yes.
The way I feel about being able to travel anywhere at the moment.
Right.
That's a negative.
That is a negative. Agreed. And I appreciate your analogy about discussing with patients what you know to be true. As people probably know, I quit clinical medicine because I was working at the Veterans Administration, seeing these people who needed so much help, and I had experienced ayahuasca and the other psychedelic healing, and to not be able to share with them was entirely too out of alignment. And so now I
was
do this.
I was wondering about that part. Right. I worked at the VA many years ago, and it's such a sad business when you're a physician and something is legal in your state and you still can't give it.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
It's bad enough for the illegals.
Right, exactly.
So,
I'm like, that CBD could help so many of you, and I can't mention it. This is awful. So, so I broke free. Yes, but I totally agree with you. All right, let's move on, Jim, to talking about your new book, Your Symphony of Selves. And by the way, thank you so much for sending me a copy. I have thoroughly enjoyed it. Can you tell us a little bit about what led you to write this?
Well, I've been working on the question of selves, which is kind of the internal multiplicity that we all know of, for decades, literally, like over 25 years. And when Jordan Gruber and I, who are old friends, at some point got together, and he said he would like to help me. He ended up really writing, a huge amount of the book from his own scholarship. Partly it just fascinated me that we have no way to understand easily our own inconsistency. And my family has been really ragging on me for decades. Dad, you have to write this book. And, and this is my daughter who's a full professor. So I'm really getting serious nag. And so we finally did it. And what we're saying is that the inconsistencies you see in yourself, and particularly in the people you love, is not inconsistency. It is they have several selves, and you do too. And if you begin to think in that way, curiously, the world becomes easier. You understand things differently, and you are kinder to yourself and more compassionate to others. And that is the reason the book exists.
I think that so perfectly describes why it felt like a hug reading it. Because it does.
Oh, that's just wonderful. I mean, what I realized is, and I've written a self-help book a number of years ago about affirmations and changing beliefs, but I know that all self-help books don't work because you have to do something afterwards.
Yes.
And you don't.
Right.
It's kind of like cookbooks don't satisfy hunger.
Right.
But it's curious when you read a book that simply allows your inner attitudes to shift, and the shift feels saner. That's it. The book itself is the event.
Yes.
And the book also includes maybe 1,000 examples from every walk of life, because if it's true that all of us have internal selves, it should be visible pretty much everywhere, and it is.
Yeah.
But we have a cultural overlay that says you have only one self, and that's the way it is, and you have to fit all the data into that box.
Yes. And that's so difficult to process. Like, I remember when you wrote to me, you said this book isn't about psychedelics, but I think so many of those on a psychedelic journey, pre-ceremony, or there's so much self-work that's going into the integration process that I think it's absolutely crucial, because I think a lot of mental discomfort comes from us being hard on ourselves. And I think that's where this is huge.
It's the question we say, there's a wonderful question which we say, which is, how could I do that?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer is, you didn't.
Yes.
A part of you did.
Yeah.
And we all know, those of us who've had enough alcohol in our system at least once, to notice that we are different when with that alcohol. We are, for example, we think we're cleverer and we're not. We may be gushily affectionate. We may be mean.
Mm-hmm.
But in the morning we think, how could I have done that? And the answer is, the one that woke up didn't do it.
Right. The part that I thought was fascinating is in that same, when you wake up and you're like, the one who woke up is not the one who had, was very affectionate during alcohol or whatever. You had mentioned, and there's a quote, like, the part of the person that shows up at psychotherapy is usually not the same self that's having the issues that they're bringing to psychotherapy.
Exactly. It's like, really, you're bringing the wrong person.
Yes.
And family therapy, in a sense, all psychotherapy should be considered as family therapy, because it's more than one self in the room.
Yes.
And the trick is, how do you bring in the self that has the problem? And for instance, there's a brilliant group called AA, And they've worked it out where they encourage the drunk to talk at the meetings.
Yeah.
Not the person who's horrified and ashamed and sickened by their drunkenness. And that they work with the person who actually does the drinking. And it's quite moving when you go to an AA meeting because you're seeing people talking. Their quote, worst selves are conversing and sharing and helping each other. And I did research on alcohol a long time ago, and psychotherapy was the worst, by the way, method. Had the lowest, it had about a 2% improvement rate.
Uh-huh. Probably because of that, because
wrong person.
Your sober self shows up. That's not the one with the issues. So interesting.
Right.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh, I was going to say,
I'm not going to interrupt what you say. I love that.
Well, because there's just so many cool parts of this book that, like, if somebody by any means was not, like, totally sold on the multiplicity of selves, by the time they get to the absent-mindedness part, I think they if you could describe how you talk about absent-mindedness and selves, because then that makes so much sense. That was the clearest description of anything for me.
Well, let me give you one simple and one a little more complicated. The simple one is you walk into the kitchen and you get halfway towards the refrigerator and you think, why am I here? And you realize that in between your intention and getting the refrigerator, you switched. You kind of switched into another part of yourself that really wasn't informed why we're going to the refrigerator. A different one, and a little more complicated, is if you drive the same route to work every day. That route is you really know that route. And what you will notice sometimes is you're thinking of something else, and several miles have passed, and you have no awareness of doing the driving.
Correct.
And there's this momentary whoop. And really, obviously, some part of you was paying attention to the road, was looking at the road signs, was looking at traffic, was doing the many cognitive tasks that are vital for driving. And so, what it allows you to do is to realize that you can switch selves to the one that's more appropriate, but you can also see what happens. We have a different word, which is the negative word, called triggered. If you talk to someone who has a different political persuasion than you these days, the chances are, if you bring it up, they will be triggered and there will be upset between you.
Yes.
Because that part of themselves is very different than the part who's your friend. So those are kind of examples of where we see it. And we also see where we say to our children, such and such is coming, behave.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember when I sent my little children who were they were kind of legally under the limit to fly, but we kind of pushed it, and they flew from San Francisco to Los Angeles to be with my parents for a weekend. And they did whatever they did, but the report from my father was how nice their manners were, meaning table manners, among other things. And I thought, I don't know whose children he's talking about. My children are kind of the children of ex-hippies, and we are very casual. And so I asked them, and they were like 4 and 6, and they said, we made a game out of it because we knew your parents cared about that. So they were polite. They were being polite little children, which they had access to, but it wasn't something they did very often.
Oh, that's so interesting. That's really advanced for 4 and 6-year-olds to know which self to pull out at the table. I love that.
Well, I think that 4 and 6-year-olds do that. I mean, if you watch them, they're great at playing at different selves, and they're also great at saying, "No, I don't want you to be that person anymore," and then they stop.
So interesting. I wanted to bring up if anybody else still doesn't understand why this book makes you feel so good. I love the part where you talk about that when you acknowledge that there's these different selves, it helps you with the discussion about having versus being a bad dog, as you put it, where like if you have one or more dysfunctional selves, that's not who you are, and that you don't have to over-identify with that self.
And that's huge in your life, because the problem we get into is not only we identify with that part, but other people do. For instance, I'm sure most of the people listening can say, well, in my family, there was this relative, Uncle Edward, and we all liked him, and then he cheated my father in a real estate deal, and we've never talked to him since. And the answer is that part of him did that, but most of him is the Uncle Edward you know. And when you get that, then you realize that you can reach through to the Uncle Edward you know, and you may not be able to reach the one that cheated you, because most of Uncle Edward never did. And then when you start applying that to yourself, you see we're all Uncle Edwards. I'm thinking, and I'm not sharing some of the things I've done that the Jim Fadiman on the phone really wouldn't have done, and was really quite amazed that he did it. And even as you're doing something wrong, it's like the famous, which is don't write a text to your ex too late at night.
Right.
Because in the morning oh my God.
Morning self is not
okay.
happy.
You're right. The morning self is not happy. And the difference between the morning self and the evening self, in most relationships, when you say, is there a difference between your morning self and your evening self, they each look at the other because they see it in the other. I'm just thinking it's not in the book, which is at one point when I would be depressed, this is I think maybe when I was a graduate student, I would withdraw and I would read science fiction. But I would read it late. And I would get to a point where I would say, if I continue reading this, I will be tired tomorrow, I will be cross, I will not be able to work as well. It will be deleterious for me in a dozen ways. And I keep reading. Because the part of me that's reading doesn't have to worry about it.
Oh, right. Evening you.
Yeah, so the evening me can say, well, I'm enjoying this story, and of course I could read more of it tomorrow, and nothing's going to change. But right now, I'm in an indulgent state, and I don't really care that you're going to be too tired in the morning. I'm not, thanks for letting me know, but no thanks. So we have internal dialogues. And the internal dialogue is like the most obvious notion, which is, have you ever argued with yourself?
Yeah.
And the answer is, of course.
Yes.
And then the question that suddenly opens Pandora's box is, who was the other person arguing?
Right.
Okay, and that kind of breaks what we call the single state assumption, single self assumption, which is clearly there's internal divisions. And we just explore that with where it appears in popular literature, in poetry, in neuroscience, in religion, in philosophy, because it's important to sensitize ourselves to the reality of it. And then your world works better.
Yeah, that's what I loved, is that after the parts of the book that show us different ways in which we are different selves, then you moved into helping those reading it with how to work with those selves. Because like you pointed out, this is one of my favorite phrases that was separated, is that mental health is being in the right mind at the right time. And therefore, right, those of us who are working on improving our mental health, if we're reading the book and we're not in the self we'd like to be in at the time, you offered some ways to shift between selves.
Exactly. But we want to help people shift at will into the right self and not get triggered. And even when triggered, to be able to get back out of it.
Yes. Which is huge. And I was reading your book while I had a trigger and I was using it in real time. And let me tell you to everybody else out there, buy the book. This is you can watch yourself shift into something else and then be triggered. And then there's just such an expansive list of ways that you talk about to shift.
Yeah. Well, because there should be an expansive list of ways, because human beings have been dealing with themselves for thousands of years. And one of the things that holds it back is we have a monotheistic religion which says there's one God, which we kind of, in Christianity, we kind of cheat a little with the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, and a million angels, but we kind of have a notion of oneness. And a lot of very, very fine psychotherapeutic systems work with selves, but they kind of wish there was a single self. And because we don't have a theory, we're just, I call us explorers. We're just discovering where the multiple selves appear, and we find, to our amazement, everywhere, so that people make their own decisions about lots of wonderful metaphysical questions, like where do selves arise from, how many selves are there, and we describe all that, but we don't come down on any particular way of holding it.
I also like the part where you were talking about the fact that we can shift into a different self by physical proximity or our environment or a certain kind of item that we have or object, because I thought in people trying to do integration work, if they had found some, gratitude or forgiveness through a psychedelic journey, perhaps they could go to the same setting or listen to the playlist and bring up that self again.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. The playlist is particularly powerful in bringing you back into that space.
And I noticed one of the other ways on the list might have been microdosing.
Well, it might have been, but it's actually not written there.
Oh, I got it from there was an asterisk.
Oh, you saw the little teeny footnote.
I saw the footnote.
You're impressive. Because what I say to people, particularly my psychedelic crowd, is this isn't about psychedelics, but there is a footnote. Yeah, because what we know with microdosing is that you're moving back into equilibrium, and that often will be a change of cells as well. So when people who are depressed say they're not depressed, we don't know if they still have a depressed self. We just don't know. But it's a little bit like very often what psychotherapy does is say, let's go back and look at some stuff you've never looked at, and people will sometimes relive old experiences. So they're there somewhere. So our theory is you don't lose any selves.
Yeah.
But you do get better at picking the right one at the right time. And if you think about it, you're at work, you want your work self. Let's say you're a coder. So you want to be deeply involved in this very abstract cleverness world. But when you go home and your children say, Daddy, you don't want to look at them and say, I wonder if I could code an app for Daddy. You want to just be totally into the love that you not only feel for your children, but the shift in brain chemistry that you'll get if you give them a hug. Now that my kids are older, I have a couple of small dogs, and when I come home and they both run out of the house and down our small driveway, I always shift. It's impossible to be in a bad mood when a small animal says, "Oh my God, you are alive! You exist! You're going to come close to me,"
Right.
And I feel, I guess I'm all right. I'm a nice person.
I'm an okay guy. I think that's an amazing point. I hadn't thought about that before, but I've been wanting a puppy recently, and I think that that's a huge part of it. Is like you can't be stressed out about podcast editing person when little puppy is coming at you. There's just one person you can be in. It's ball of love.
Right, and what's lovely is you have access to that place in you that turns into mush when your puppy comes and licks your nose.
Yes. Jim, this has been absolutely delightful. Can you please tell people where they can find you and your work and your new book?
Well, the new book, Your Symphony of Selves, is surprisingly on Amazon. And I have a website, jamesfadiman.com, which has a lot of talks, a lot of presentations, and a bunch of articles. It also includes some photographs and some fiction, just stuff. So it's kind of like being invited to my house and being able to rummage in the drawers. And my email is jfadiman, that's one word, at Gmail. And if you write me and say, oh, there was a wonderful program, where can I get some? Don't worry, I won't answer you.
I can only imagine your inbox, Jim.
It's sometimes pretty scary, but also people write with very specific questions and difficult problems. And very often we'll just say, go to microdosingpsychedelics.com for basic information. Because, again, we're not, we're explorers. We're the people who go to the undiscovered island and describe it well enough so that experts can then come in later.
Well, I very much appreciate your exploration and sharing your findings with us. This has been absolutely phenomenal and a total honor. And I know the listeners are going to be very excited to hear their questions answered one by one. So, Jim, thank you again for spending this time with us.
Well, I loved this being with you. And also, when you have a new book out, when someone really gets it, it's very close to when my little dog says hello. It's just a big rush of good feelings.
Oh, well, I'm glad I could be your tiny puppy for the past 20 minutes or so. But last night I just thought, this book makes me feel great about myself. I think everybody should, if microdosing makes you feel just a little bit better, grab your Symphony of Selves. It's easier to find and totally legal.
That's true. It's still legal. Get it while you can.
I love it. Thank you so much, Jim.
Okay. Thank you and thank Robert again for both of us.
Absolutely. Will do. All right. For everybody else out there, until next time. Thanks so much for listening to the Plant Medicine Podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, please leave us an iTunes rating or review. It helps other people find the show. And if you'd like to find out more about plant medicine, including the show notes from today's episode, please head over to plantmedicine.org. The music for the Plant Medicine Podcast is by the incredible Porangi. If you'd like to check out his music, please find him at porangi.com or on social media at PORANGUI.